Chapter 3, Scene 1. Upon Mr. Winter's shabby but sturdy desk inside his glasshouse sat several items of philosophical curiosity, or rather, implements that partly assisted in the satisfying of such when applied with a delicate and decisive touch, concerning the chemical analysis of soil and vegetative matter. Running along the back of the desk was a small open shelf of thoughtless design, save its dimension, that of little less than the forearm of a man, which kept atop it many glass vials whose contents were plainly labelled with Orphic titles: spirit of salt, oil of vitriol, muriate of ammonia, neutral carbonate of potash, and the like, that when gathered together in such an arrangement, no doubt would make the simple Christian farmer of either of the towns, with more emphasis toward the Baptist Hedgely, shudder. Vials of soil, not but several days collected too, sat about, crowding the argand lamp, the balance, the Wedgwood pestle and mortar, the few sieves and blotting paper filters, the Hessian crucible, one of a set of Queen's ware evaporating basins, a bone knife, and a few other unmentionables. Mr. Winter himself sat attentively at his desk, holding a thermometer into 400 grains of soil in a particular evaporating basin situated by a stand over his lamp, that the soil achieve a degree of temperature roughly equal to 300 degrees Fahrenheit, but not more, such being the prescribed amount in which water, naturally adherent to the soil, even after considerable drying in the air of the glasshouse, would be set free, so that he may compare the soil's weight before and after the procedure to ascertain the weight of this water. At 12 minutes' time, he placed his basin upon its position on the balance, took off 30 grain of weight, smirked, then took off 5 more before the motion of the arms of the device was observed. On a bit of parchment he scribbled, Sample 6, Entry 1, lost 35 grain of weight of water. Suspect a fair amount of vegetative matter, though aluminous earth cannot yet be reconciled. This, of course, would be transferred into his superior desk's leather journal, along with the grain weight of each particular element that the sample contained, after the man had performed the other handful of steps required for their discovery. Several other samples derived from his own field had already been processed that day, and their respective parchments contained assays whose format regularly followed the following example. Sample 2, adherent water, 30 grain, loose stone and gravel, silicious and calcareous origin, 37 grain, undecompounded vegetable fibres, 9 grain, fine silicious sand, 106 grain, fine calcareous sand, 64 grain, carbonate of lime, 37 grain, carbonate of magnesia, 2 grain, vegetative matter, 13 grain, silica, 41 grain, alumina, 32 grain, oxide of iron, 5 grain, soluble vegetable matter, 8 grain, gypsum, 2 grain, total, 386 grain. Mr. Winter's field appeared to be credibly homogeneous in its heterogenic assembly of these compounds, at least through the depth of the topsoil, and with its wealth of vegetative and impalpable matter, he concluded it kept a very wholesome assay, which explained the luxurious nature of the ryegrass upon it, and perhaps the fine production of the apple trees as well. Concluding his scribbling, he found his neighbour, Farmer John Huxley, approaching the glasshouse with 2 sacks of soil from his own field, and though the glass did not render images of the outer world to perfection, he appeared ill-laboured and pink, his breath materialising on the chilled air at a frequency as were he a steam-powered engine. "Mr. Huxley, there you are. I would have called with the cart, but allow me to now at least call inward for a pint on your behalf. Madam, madam," he hallooed at a maid collecting firewood for the kitchen stove. "Oh dear, I've forgotten her name, the creature. Madam, please do make it known that we are in company and request a few pints of cider from the kitchen." "Mr. Winter, sir," Farmer Huxley started, applying his sacks to the ground in front of the glasshouse with a jovial grunt that he was rid of them. Then, as he caught more of his breath, he continued, "I've a few more from different spots, each along its own course of rotation, though not a one is yet manured until the spring." "Thank you, Mr. Huxley. You are most kind in your donations. I shall repay you and your family with a series of dinners at a frequency of your choosing, for I have a fine room that sees little use, and have recently taken a girl from Mr. Moore's kitchen and made her of all things a cook. Now I fear she may be desirous of practice, attending only my small staff and my own poor diet. Come in, and you will see what I am to do with all these sacks, or rather, their contents," said Mr. Winter, inviting his neighbour to follow him back into the glass-house. "We would delight in that, sir. Always happy to trade a bucket of dirt for a bite of pudding, if you don't mind me saying so. It's quite warmer in here, is it not?" "It is indeed, sir, for the temperature is a vital component for what is soon to come of this rabble." Mr. Winter motioned at a numerous set of empty wooden boxes, each the same size, that which a man could stand inside, with half his torso and all below it hidden. "I am not yet there, but here presently," he continued in a warm and mildly excited tone, pointing at his desk and anticipating the pleasure in the presentation of his ideas to a not unenthusiastic representative of the class of folk in which, he hoped, they primarily would benefit. And it was without objection, or comment even from his neighbour, that he laid into the plumb of his plan. There are a number of ways in which a soil may be compared to that of a neighbouring one. The benefit of such I will explain afterward, if you've not already smoked it. The process starts by weighing a particular soil against the weight of water, and further the content of the water obstinately stuck to the earthly, animal or vegetative matter. I'm sure you know better than I that a soil less hungry for water provides the element more readily to its vegetative inhabitants, for its texture and content allow the pulling and retention of the unseen water in the air down into the soil, or the reduction of the reverse. Afterward, I remove the gravel and stone, and the hard vegetable fibres, and find whether the former is of a calcareous, silicious, or a luminous variety, or some combination thereof. True and true again, earthly matter of a calcareous origin effervesces when this muriatic acid is applied to it. The others too have unique properties of identification. The silica will scratch a bit of glass. Luckily I have a few remainders from the construction of this building, and the alumina is soft enough that it may be cut with this knife, if any be around here. I've only found it in the impalpable matter thus far. Here the soil of interest is boiled, that when cooled and agitated, the sand may be divided from the fine earthly matter by washing and filtration, for you see it does come to rest rightly before the finer matter upon a good stir. The sand itself may be acted upon by the acid just in the way of the gravel, and what does not dissolve is silicious, whilst that which does is certainly calcareous, the weight difference between the practice allowing us to discover their proportions. The finer matter too will be so enacted upon by the acid that all carbonate of lime and magnesia and oxide of iron would be solubilized and separated, again by filter, and further shall be individually done so by one. The addition of prussiate of potassa until all oxide of iron falls out as a blue precipitate and is then collected by filter. 2. The addition of neutralized carbonate of potash to gather the carbonate of lime similarly. And 3. A fine boiling and the addition of carbonic acid to do so for the magnesia, if any. But here are our pints. You see, the glass makes it difficult for any man, beast or service to surprise us. Ha ha ha, he laughed, still enamoured with his glass laboratory. It was either Mr. Winter's zeal or the strained walk down his northwestern field that made the farmer thirsty as a sandy soil, and the pint went down well between compliments toward its quality. And after having his humours enlivened by the cider, the man blotted his beard with a handkerchief and returned a bit of his host's delight. "Sir, I give you joy of it all, but perhaps you will share with me the comparative acts, for I've gotten caught up in the manoeuvres. Well, Mr. Huxley, with your contributions, I may compare any differences occurring upon what I would venture is very similar land at different points upon its rotation. These two, in aggregate, can be compared against my field, which has not been touched for some time, and those against representative pastures and fields around Woodbridge and Hedgely. These are but means to familiarise myself with the land around the towns. They do not provide, by their own merit, much practical improvement of any farmer's situation. My design, however, lies in comparisons of yield and soil content, specifically regarding the town's poorest producing fields, be they derelict or otherwise, with further pursuit of those who seem to possess a prejudicial quality unexplainable to their stewards. I believe in these cases I will find a significant discrepancy concerning the elemental qualities when examined against those of the salubrious fields in their proximity. With these particularities, I shall then offer remedies, such as a mineral manure in the case of a deficiency, in hopes to mimic the latter's qualities, and in doing so, nature itself. Mr. Huxley pressed his lips against his teeth as he examined the elemental reductions and their respective weights on one of the many parchment scraps Mr. Winter had used in his day's work, and then offered, "Some of us did attempt a pinch of quarry manuring after the year without a summer, but I'm sorry to say, sir, there was not much improvement." "Ah, we share the same sentiment, Mr. Huxley," cried Winter, aroused once again. "You've smoked the reason for my boxes and humble purchase of your hand full of seed. In these I will load the soils of these impoverished fields, as well as some from those credible, again for comparison. Each particular soil of poor quality will be assigned 3 boxes, one in which it is not in any way improved, another improved by animal or vegetative manure available to its steward, and lastly, one in which my prescribed improvements are issued. Each box will receive the same quantities of water, light and heat, for you see I will, with the help of my man, rotate the boxes about the room every few days, and lastly, each box will indeed contain 1 specimen of your winter wheat. After 3 months of growth, I will make comparisons with the qualities of the plants, heads per plant, seeds per head, and the weight of the seeds, as well as a general description of their appearances. I then design to repeat the entire process in January, whilst repeating certain soils redundantly during both the first and that second midwinter course to reduce the aspect of seed variability. So you see, improvements to the fields would only be made if there is clear, repetitive evidence that my remedies are credible. Here let me read to you a particular passage that has caught my interest from Davy's agricultural chemistry book. This is what he says of a garden of grass and barley in the months of May and June, which was watered twice weekly with various waters infused with simple elements. The plants watered with solutions of the sulfates grew just in the same manner as plants watered with rainwater. Those acted upon by the solution of nitre, acetate, and supercarbonate of potassa, and muriate of ammonia, grew rather better. Those treated with the solution of carbonate of ammonia grew most luxuriously of all. Chapter 3, Scene 2. "Oh, and there is Mr. Winter, Charlotte, and again he makes way to the very back of the room. Would I but knew the enchantment! But never mind. Mamma, would it at all be taken crooked were Charlotte and I to keep poor Mr. Winter company along the back row? Perhaps, considering this not being a proper sermon, we could be relieved of our traditional arrangement, for it's a bit dim and draughty in his section, and we may cheer him in spite of it." Harriet composedly begged from her family's reserved forward section of the church seating, as she kept watch over the nave's entrance. Mrs. Moore, too, twisted her neck toward her shoulder, that she may hesitantly chance to look over it. Then, having returned to her forward comfort, she returned, "Goodness, child, what would the town think? The Moore ladies imposed in such squalor. And what would your papa think, looking down upon us, and his family strewn about like vagabonds? But all right, as we are well broken of orthodoxy already, you may do so. And dear, try at least to convince the gentleman to endeavour toward the front rows. He's quite in danger of being made an eccentric back there, though I suppose the darkness puts out the sting of that blue coat, topping it a bit much he is, for our humble setting." With many eyes pretending not to follow the Moore girls to the back of the church, and fewer ears pretending to miss Miss Moore's Mr. Winter, a third time, I believe, Mrs. George Moore, having also observed such, declared, "Not so well matched, Fanny. He's more of a thinking man than a faithful man." "Faith, we're well past the idyllic with Harriet owning 25 years, replied Mrs. Jonathan Moore. "Besides, Mr. Moore has grown adventurous as of the last year, as I'm sure you've noticed at more than one dinner. As long as the man, or any such gentleman, as I hesitate in marking this particular one, was not in absolute indifference to the church, thoughtful or not, he would do. Were I to speak on her behalf, however, I would declare him perfection, solely on the ground that his home is quite near the bookstore, the silly girl. What say you, Mr. Moore? Oh, I do find him a credible man in all respects, the squire reacted, with design of masking his mild irritation from having been called on along this particular subject. Though I suspect that as he is something of a quiet, thoughtful man of material philosophy, who may indeed gather from life full satisfaction from but the work of his own mind, Harriet would run circles round him, as she does us, and as she may be doing presently. He seemed a bit put off by her upon their first meeting at Woodbridge Manor. I shall not look back and judge his countenance directly, but if ever she did convince him, his kindness and situation does convince me. "Thank ye each and all, thank ye, roared Jonathan Moore as he inhabited the lectern, that he could attenuate the room's merry conversation, empowered by the victuals the parsonage had provided the flock to convince them of this secondary afternoon sermon before them. It was heartwarming to see such spirit in the knave, for he anticipated another round of shy and blank countenances upon the conclusion of the lecture, and that they had recovered from his previous queer talk of change, the Sunday last removed, gave him confidence that they would do so again, beyond today's. Smiling, he did then briefly check the table flanking his position, rightward, in front of the chancel, which kept several curious stones and a few plain, clear rummers filled with water, and as the conversation flickered out, he began. "Friends, once already we've gathered this day for the sake of our souls, and now we do so again with happy, swollen bellies, for the sake of our minds, and for my part, the sake of my dearest brother Charles, who I've mentioned was a natural philosopher. Would you had only known him as I did, and do, and it was he, so greater qualified than the man before you to say what will be said today, who was here to dig into the spotted dog alongside us, and then offer the bit of wisdom which I presently endeavour to communicate. Those that do aspire to the understanding of this material, my heart is with you, for in doing so, surely you will have fulfilled this desire of mine. And thus it is, I find, appropriate to say a few introductory words about the qualities of the natural philosopher. Most of us, throughout our toiling upon the earth, acquire uncommon knowledge, that of a skill or trade, by means of learning it from a preceptor infused with such, who too has done so by that self-same process of acquisition. A ploughman teaches his son the plough, and a smith teaches his apprentice the forge. Yet this is so abundant that one may be forgiven if he is not familiar with the natural philosopher's unique means of gain, that of reason, thorough disciplined observation, and the collective sharing of ideas among peers. He reasons an object or system has a particular quality, defends this with observable evidence or other rationalization, and shares such with other thoughtful men that collective wisdom informs his suppositions to be just or not. And blessed be the latter feature, for through our island's royal societies and universities, such has come to bear with a particular proficiency these last several decades. Further, through this process, it also comes to pass, the definition of what is known, what can be known, and what cannot, at the frontier of the procurement of new knowledge. And even further, it shall not be mistook that the natural philosopher does not gain knowledge or information by the way of the commoner. He too submits to authority, firstly when he is young and in want of guidance along his particular field of interest, and secondly when he is experienced and seeks to gain the experience of men whose fields are nebulous to his, that he may sharpen the reason applied to his own, the system being complementary. Just as in our town, the ploughman is reliant on the farrier for horseshoes, and the farrier too on the miner for his trade material, so also a constellation of interdependent relationships exist in the world of science. Reason begets reason, as knowledge does knowledge. Were it their stomachs or the remarks having to do with the right and venerable ploughman, the audience exhibited their familiar nods and brief, mute openings of their mouths in agreement with Mr. Moore's findings. Even so, he felt it necessary to apply a simple example where 2 horses were seen to enter a stable, whilst but one was seen to come out. The observer's task being to use rational thought and indirect observation to provide evidence that the second animal was still present. Impressed by his audience at this, he further gave an example of how a thing can be known generally, even as what is known of the details is limited. In fair, summer weather, it may take a carriage travelling from Edinburgh to London a good 10 days to accomplish its route, he argued, and in poor winter weather it may take 20 days or longer. So it may be known that such a venture could take between 10 and 20 days or longer, though for any one particular trip it cannot be known, the precise time of arrival, such being dependent upon the weather, the vitality of horses and carriage wheels, the health of the passengers, etc. Again, this was well taken, which prompted him further toward the meat of his lecture. And so with that introduction, I will now entertain you along a subject that has caused an amount of uproar in Edinburgh, one which has afforded both criticism and defence, where arguments on particular details may be shown to be just in some cases, but still fail to refute the general idea, for it is hardy with much evidence lending it support, one which my brother did staunchly champion. It will be of some interest here, I believe, as it is intimately concerned with the properties of the soils, yet there is a much greater goose to be cooked. In the year 1785, a philosopher expert on the workings of the earth did present to the Royal Society of Edinburgh a theory based upon the findings of both his eye and mind. James Hutton was the man's name, and he called his idea the theory of the earth, which he later published at the end of the century. I do indeed own a copy, and it is ramblously profound. Let us begin to understand it. Hutton starts his book with the following observation. When we trace the parts of which this terrestrial system is composed, and when we view the general connection of those several parts, the whole presents a machine of a peculiar construction by which it is adapted to a certain end. We perceive a fabric, erected in wisdom, to obtain a purpose worthy of the power that is apparent in the production of it. And goes on to pronounce, we shall thus also be led to acknowledge an order, not unworthy of divine wisdom, in a subject which, in another view, has appeared as the work of chance, or as absolute disorder and confusion. You see, Hutton had found that the earth is a machine made up of many parts: rock, soil, heat, water, air, ocean, plants and animals, which through particular observation of such he concluded is in a constant motion that brings about both the destruction and renewal of rock, sand and soil, that we farmers may never be in want of it. Let us enjoy his reason. We must first concede the man had a proficient understanding of the classification of minerals, feldspar, gypsum, etc., and what he did not know, just as I've previously stated concerning the interconnectedness of science, he found in a book by a right man of minerals by the name of Cronstead. Now we may address his first point, that across our earth, whether it be along the shore or as high up as the Alps or Andes mountains, soaring features of the New World, it is found that the rock is inundated with the relics of sea creatures of long ago. He further found that our calcareous rocks, soil, chalk and the like, are indeed made up of the shells and bodies of a particular set of these creatures, coral or cockle shells as examples, for it is quite uncommon to find a stratum of such without having these relics embedded, and they are of the self-same elements, shown by our men of chemistry. Here again I will refer to his writing. But that which renders the original of our land clear and evident is the immense quantities of calcareous bodies which had belonged to animals, and the intimate connection of these masses of animal production with the other strata of the land. For it is to be proved that all these calcareous bodies, from the collection of which the strata were formed, have belonged to the sea, and were produced in it. He then had reckoned a mechanism for how it became that these creatures of long ago had transformed into our fine rock of lime. He did so by contemplating the following. Firstly, that inside these marbles, these chalks and marls, there exists, by his words, a sparry structure or a crystalline expression of the limestone that may only be born from a state of fluidity. Secondly, that as glass or iron may be molten, so too may be rock, as shown by the work of volcanoes. Thirdly, that the interstices of our rock's strata, each articulate in its particular mineral composition, are consolidated upon each other in a manner that only can occur by a state of molten fluidity, whilst there are examples of calcareous regions, such as those of the Isle of Wight, whose hardness is a feature of their strata's depth, soft and crumbly atop, graduating to well consolidated below, and lastly, the general observance of what one would conclude was the attrition of rock, gravel, and sand by the work of water against them, inland or along the shore, and the taking of soil by a flooded stream or ditch away from its original position upon the land. And from these he offered that, as the marine animals' shells accumulate upon the sea floor at their deaths, their structures are worn by attrition, motivated by the ocean's inexhaustible currents, so that most of their matter becomes finer particulates, just as we may break apart a marl or limestone into an impalpable substance to manure our fields. This broken shell is then covered by even more of such, or thusly by sand or soils, being deposited into our oceans from river outlets, having been taken and carried there from inland. The process continues until what was once the floor of the ocean now is quite underneath. Here I will demonstrate how the accumulation forms particular interstices of the strata. Mr. Moore visited his table, held up his rummer that was resting atop it to show his audience, then filled it partly with a chalky soil from a bag underneath. Once again displaying the object, he continued to fill it with a darker, sandy material from a second bag, then topped it off with the original entity, that the effect was 3 layers of material shown through the clear wall of the cup. A few smiles, a few inquisitive faces, and a few blinking eyes replied to the display, yet the lack of nods compelled the lecturer, with his other hand, to hold up a shale specimen with many thin strata, as a comparator to the rummer. How does this become this? To answer, Hutton apprises the lurid toil of the volcano, whose many instances occur both on land and in the ocean, Mount Etna and the ancient Mount Vesuvius being right examples. He argues they are not but isolated events, but express a regular and extensive heat of unfathomable power that occurs deep within the earth. And just as this heat produces fluid rock that ejects from the mouths of these mountains, it too causes a general fluidity in the material deep inside the earth that bakes and consolidates our pore shells, sands and soils, which when cooled creates the hardened rocks of strata, pieces of which now lie on this table. Take care not to drop them when passing them around. Let us hear again from Hutton as we do so, who further presented many cases that this fluidity is not of an aqueous origin, but solely heat. We have strata consolidated by calcareous spar, a thing perfectly distinguishable from the stalactical concretion of calcareous earth in consequence of aqueous solution. We have strata made solid by the formation of fluor, a substance not soluble, so far as we know, by water. We have strata consolidated with sulphureous and bituminous substances, which do not correspond to the solution of water. We have strata consolidated with silicious matter, in a state totally different from that under which it has been observed, on certain occasions, to be deposited by water. We have strata consolidated by feldspar, a substance insoluble in water. We have strata consolidated by almost all the various metallic substances, with their almost endless mixtures and sulphureous compositions. That is to say, we find, perhaps, every different substance introduced into the interstices of strata which had been formed by subsidence at the bottom of the sea. Here too is a Spanish pudding stone, a marble, in which gravel also has been caught up in this baking process, and is made to perfectly conform to the calcareous material around it, see how well it takes polish, and note the fusion of the two species of mineral on this piece, feldspar and quartz, I believe, and contemplate how this feature could ever exist without but the fluidity found in heat and pressure. Yet Hutton did not desist at the horizon of these ideas and retire, to the comfort of his colleagues. No, he exploded their comfort by further offering that this heat not only affords molten lava from fiery mountain summits, but does inject our strata when in a relatively cooler state, that endeavouring to become from the ocean dry land, with veins of liquid mineral and metal, sometimes by violent fracturing, exemplifying the immortal power of the bowels of the earth. His reasons that did oblige him to torment these learned men are that such hardened Venus injections are found on land who has known no volcano, ancient or not, that they do contain fractured shards of the impregnated strata, attributed to the sudden nature of the operation, and too the same crystalline and fusion features we've thus covered are there present. Here I've a capital stone that has been collected by a naturalist retracing Hutton's journey to Glen Tilt in the Cairngorm Mountains. Observe this pinked granite injected into this dull sandstone. This stone puts to rest the notions that granite is a primeval substance, for here it is clearly injected into, by plain reason, an older piece of sandstone, and the foolishness that granite was original of sedimentation or chemical precipitation from an aqueous fluid. Now let us to the goose. This unimaginable heat does not but consolidate material to stone and fracture and inject new land into the ground. It has a mechanical force of equally inhuman magnitude. Hutton says, "We are not to limit nature with our imbecility or estimate the powers of nature by the measure of our own. Wherefore does it come to pass that the remnants of marine animals do appear in the bodies of the great Alps? It is this force that compels the land from the oceans to rise, dry out, and continue its journey upward. The motive power of this heat is shown by strata found twisted from their horizontal, sedimentary position in the abyss into every possible position, be it vertical, bent, doubled over from their plane position, and even broken. One plate in his book does show a drawing of strata from Jedburgh, Scotland, in which horizontal layers sit atop vertical layers, a proposition Hutton called angular unconformity, and by its sight one is struck with terrible appreciation for this motive power. Further, he proposed that none of all which I've addressed this day is of limited accident in the system. Rather, these operations occur in uniform fashion with regard to the global system, that not one nook or cranny lies untouched, for he does say, "But from the accounts of travellers and from the specimens which are brought to us from distant parts, we have reason to believe that all the rest of the earth is of the same nature with that which has been now considered. The great masses of the earth are the same everywhere, and all the different species of earths, of rocks or stone, which have as yet appeared, are to be found in the little space of this our island. And just as the earth, this perpetual apparatus, reinvigorates itself by the formation of new land, it does so by the destruction of old land, decayed by attrition through the work of water, rain, flood, tide and current. That rock begets gravel, gravel begets sand, sand begets impalpable clay, and these are carried back to the oceans as nutrients that continue the process. All the while, by our relic evidence, plants and animals do thrive, the self-same species in fact, and perhaps a few that we are not yet acquainted. Let me re-emphasize this. The land we do set foot upon was once the floor of the abyss, and before it was so, was olden land from a world that does no longer exist, save the species of animals and plants that are more indifferent to the process, and that olden land is thus begotten from that proficiently older. Hutton also puts to the point that the forces which cause such change do still exist at present, undiminished in their power. I will further emphasize that these suppositions are not prophecy derived from a vast imagination. They fully rest upon the merits of observation and reason. In the man's words, "It must not be imagined that this undertaking is a thing unreasonable in its nature, or that it is a work necessarily beset with any insurmountable difficulty, for, however imperfectly we may fulfil this end proposed, yet, so far as it is to natural causes that are to be ascribed the operations of former time, and so far as, from the present state of things, or knowledge of natural history, we have it in our power to reason from effect to cause, there are, in the constitution of the world, which we now examine, certain means to read the annals of a former earth. Yes, Mr. Orton, you've something for us." He called upon a man, indeed a well-respected ploughman, whom the parson had known first as a young scarer of birds, then a cowboy, and presently as a devout Christian man. The labourer had heard every word of the lecture, that he felt the ominous prodrome of a splenic fever derived from the gross disparity between what he knew of the world, which had indeed been impressed upon him in that very church, and that which Mr. Hutton, and now seemingly Mr. Moore, did know. This, and his familiarity with Mr. Moore, compelled him to speak. "Beg pardon, sir. Beg pardon, Mr. Moore, but we none of us simple folk have ever heard any account of land rising up from the ocean, and perhaps it's on account that we are so very far from it, yet we further do neither see rocks turn to soil, at least in any quantity needed to remake an entire stretch of land." This caused some break of propriety, and muddled agreement and exclamation within the room. "Ah, and neither do I, Mr. Orton, and there are no accounts that the natural features observed around seaports as far back as ancient Greece or Rome are worn in any measurable way through attrition, yet the land plainly tells us it is true. This illuminates the most profound feature of this earthly system, that the interval between ancient Rome and present is but a grain of time inside a heavenly glass, keeping an indefinite quantity of such. Again, herein lies the matter concerning generality and detail. Just as we do not know the exact moment that it will take for any one carriage to arrive in London from Edinburgh, it is not known the age of our earth. We may only say the time between our cities is a good, long time, and hence we may only say the earth has existed a great, long time, much longer than we've been told by many a scholar who insists on adding up ages of the men of Genesis and so forth. A man of the last century, a Georges Louis Leclerc, Comte de Buffon, did observe the time in which globes of white-hot iron and rock took to cool. Then, deciding upon a mathematical relationship between their sizes and cooling times, he was able to calculate the cooling time of an earth-sized globe, and from such he pronounced the earth to be 75,000 years of age. Naturally, this was retracted to comfort the authorities of the University of Paris. Mr. Moore's last remark was drowned out by the most abhorrent destruction of silence his church had known. Several attacks on the qualities of French character leapt out, embers of the fire he had stoked with his extravagant but indefinite number of grains in the glass of deep time. And as this rabble blazed on, he quietly repeated Hutton's final sentiments issued some 35 years removed from the present, at the closing of the man's lecture in Edinburgh. We have now got to the end of our reasoning. We have no data further to conclude immediately from that which actually is, but we have got enough. We have the satisfaction to find that in nature there is wisdom, system, and consistency. For having, in the natural history of this earth, seen a succession of worlds, we may from this conclude that there is a system in nature, in like manner as, from seeing revolutions of the planets, it is concluded that there is a system by which they are intended to continue those revolutions. But if the succession of worlds is established in the system of nature, it is in vain to look for anything higher in the origin of the earth. The result, therefore, of our present inquiry is that we find no vestige of a beginning, no prospect of an end. Chapter 3, Scene 3. Mr. Winter, who looked smarter than usual, arrived at the front door of the Plough, turned about face to be sure no servants were running after him, grasped the brim of his hat for further assurance, and then entered the inn. As he paused in the entrance hall, that his cloak and hat may be put away by one of Mrs. Bagley's men, it was apparent that a most opulent display of candle and lamp burning was a rite of the local agrarian society during their monthly meetings, and peering leftward into the traditional dining hall, whose blazing fire further augmented the brightness of the inn, he noted it had been heavily boarded by labourers. Indeed, a few excusing themselves in passing him as they entered the room carried a fresh-killed rabbit, a bundle of wood, and a few turnips from their, or somebody's, cottage garden, payment for the evening's beer. He stood for a while, looking in and pinching his newly shaven chin between his thumb and forefinger, whilst a three-quarter man rejoiced that he'd just killed his pig and was rich in blood and oat pudding and smoked and salted meat, until his observations were interrupted by Mr. Huxley. "Mr. Winter, sir, we are upstairs this evening. Don't put much attention to those lads. Being drunk ain't familiar to 'em, save round the harvest when they've got something to give." Upstairs he found not only a credible set of the town's farmers, but that of its tradesmen as well, tailors, joiners, the Woodbridge schoolmaster, their veterinary surgeon, and a few coopers, butchers, maltsters, shoemakers, etc. In fact, the room kept almost 50 men, seated at long dining tables assembled for the event, and all facing frontward in order that the society's leaders may address them from the head of the place. "I've saved you a seat beside mine, sir," said Mr. Huxley during casual introductions and greetings with new and established acquaintances. "But it would be equally well were you to desire to sit afront on account of rank. The Moors will be up there with a few independents shortly." "Oh, no, this will be fine, I'm sure, Mr. Huxley, as you have more land than I," objected Mr. Winter, further adding, "and the Moors are kind, that they would never interpret it as a slight." The Moore brothers did indeed bear no ill will on account of the seating, for they were much too busy attending any man with a hello for them, and rallying the few servants to be found upon the inn's second floor, in order to take a head count that enough supper could be brought directly. Roasted pigeon, rabbit, and white cullis came up, accompanied by ragooed beans with potatoes, cabbage, and parsnips, as well as ragoos and stews of onion and cauliflower, fried toast, and not long after, potato and oatmeal puddings. Whatever wealth the town had was shown on the plates of its masters, though it was understood that the squire subsidised such feasts, his kitchen service having been seen on more than one occasion, carrying prodigious stores to the inn the mornings of their meetings, they too boarding its kitchen in the smoke, as the labourers had done the dining hall. When every sharp-set attitude had been thoroughly nourished, and pints of beer and glasses of claret and port had flowed, Mr. Moore then ritually addressed the members on various subjects related to the town's agriculture. The latest corn returns were announced, a little under 7 shillings per bushel of wheat at present. The final tally of its total production of grain that year was read, causing the affording of congratulations and joy throughout the room, and particular individuals who had provided relatively high productions of grain were acknowledged and toasted to. The squire's speech then progressed to compliments of other members of various trades. "Mr. Wilson, the finest fitting shoes in the county. Nay, the island, I say, having commissioned and worn a many pair myself. A glass of wine with you, sir." But at that point, Mr. Winter began to reflect inwardly on the members' attitudes toward their grain yields. Despite their enthusiasm, their recognition of each other's hard work, and the details of the tactics used to produce what they considered credible amounts of corn, there was a stark lack of recognition that their yields were rather small compared to other regions of England. Further, there seemed to be either a general ignorance, regarding the existence of the modern mechanised tools employed inside such regions, which of course gave those places a defined advantage, or there was a tacit agreement that they should not ever be discussed. Yet before he got too far along with his thoughts, Mr. Moore called upon him, not for perfunctory praise, but to allow him a self-introduction and to explain his designs for improvement of the town's yields. "Good evening to you all. I am Thomas Winter, who has purchased the remnants of the old Tunnadine farm that sits between Mr. Huxley's fields and those of the Baptist chapel here in Hedgely. I'm not a farmer, at least not yet, but aspire to be in the least traditional manner one could reckon. Please let me explain. This last decade I've been employed in the improvement of the mechanical apparatuses and their applications, born unto the production mills of iron, glass, and components to which these machines do depend, in the various towns both well north and south of this quiet plot of our island. But before I'm damned for such, I must say that I do not intend to tarnish the quiet here. Indeed, I flee from the clamour, adulterated air, and debauched landscape, that I may concentrate on the application of natural philosophy to the natural world." The reformed engineer then explained to the room what he had to his neighbour, Mr. Huxley, of his soil analyses and aspirations regarding both the comparison and, in proper cases, the prescribed improvement of the town's arable land. And indeed he was prepared for the quizzical brows and yawns that were produced before him, for he was quite aware that the common man's motivation had not to do with scientific discovery or its application, or perhaps even its future benefit, at the expense of the present or tradition. Thusly, at the conclusion of these sentiments, he pronounced an offering even the least industrious man in the room could not look away from. "I would be willing to sublet any impoverished field at its present value plus 5 shillings per acre, from here to the following autumn harvest, for the purposes of applying my winter findings to it, whilst I would trade any production for the labour required to maintain it with the man whose land or let it grows upon. I would also fully furnish any improvement. Any man for such a venture, or for having their soil analysed, please do introduce yourself after the formalities have concluded." Mr. Winter's offer, further cocked by the room's generous application of port and beer that afternoon, caused an amount of bustle, that he could not tell if its inhabitants were for or against him, or by what proportion they stood between these two extremes. He did hear, from the back, one fellow indirectly answer him by means of jesting at his companion. "Dear fella, have you not tried the commons?" "Ha ha 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 ha! The commons would be delighted to have you, ha ha ha!" Another, more than likely an attendant from Jonathan Moore's geology lecture earlier that week, asked him in a somewhat covert manner if he would be able to tell the age of the man's soil when he was headed back toward his seat after his turn at the front was completed. Alas, both success and folly were to be had, for afterward several farmers did approach him, confessing that Mr. Moore himself recommended him. One man claimed that the squire regarded him as a prodigious, clever conjurer of all ideas practical and a right architect of iron, glass and brick, who had once helped design a modern flour mill that was scarcely, if not at all, inflammable. A capital feat, he was sure. A fair volume of offers were made for him to survey and sample this or that field of marked disparity. There was too inquiry concerning his possible interest in quality land, left covered in ryegrass for lack of time or labour, yet to this he only could commit to sampling. It seemed high spirits would prevail that evening, unchecked, until the back of the room hecklers again presented, this time much more conspicuously. "What fools men are, sir, that aspire to triumph over Providence, let alone allow themselves to be convinced that they have any effect on the natural world entrusted to them by their Creator," pompously boasted the one named Mr. Weston, one of the two men Mr. Moore had warned him about during their first meeting at Woodbridge Manor. Indeed, the other was his companion, Mr. Smith, who also offered in a drunken and pernicious tongue, "It were not but 4 year ago, during the poverty year, that quarrymen came through the towns, the dogs, claiming they had a plot of sand and gypsum well north o' here, that was of the selfsame substance in which Scottish potato oats were well kept in their cold and wet. Said all our fields needed was but a few bushels to fortify 'em, and the let would be paid, and the hungriest mouths fed. Half the juniors among us, damnably desperate to believe 'em, took 'em up and jointly commissioned a train of carts to come down and pull 'em out o' hurt. And little good it did 'em, ha, little good at all, which you will observe there ain't one of those lot present here or about, they being ruined in the scheme. The good Lord left us animals for a reason, and quarries 100 miles removed too." "I see," replied Mr. Winter, again holding his chin as he did at the gruff crudity of the downstairs labourers. Certainly neither one of these Baptist farmers could be mistook as a junior, though it looked as if Mr. Smith was a decade less wise than his partner, and both were significantly older than himself, quite set in their ways, he reckoned. "Were any the fields or fortification tested beforehand?" he inquired. "Tested by the blood sweat of every labourer, horse and oxen in the area, and by the relentless flood that befell us." Chapter 3, Scene 4. "He did what?" cried Mr. Edwards, who proceeded to work about his mouth with his napkin, having unintentionally painted his place-setting with spittle in reaction to his particular dinner guest's reconstruction of Jonathan Moore's first natural history lecture. "Yes, sir. He told us that he was to cross out with his pen the line of Genesis that said the earth was created on the eve of Sunday, October 23rd, 4004 BC, and if any of us did too own a Bible, that we would not be wrong in doing the same, which it were not God's word but the word of man," said the guest, more concerned with accomplishing his dinner than with the purpose of it being placed before him, shy to look up too, at his host's apparent vexation. This man, this itinerant thresher who resided in the rectory's corn barn, was understandably skittish, being the lowest-ranking guest at the table, which included the magniloquent Mr. Weston, whose usual flatulent rhetoric was checked, but just barely, by his veneration of the present surround. Their now regular Sunday guest, Mr. Wyatt, who, though of an amiable attitude, was quiet fierce in his eloquent country dress and means of appearance, the chaise and 4 conspicuously placed in the rectory's driveway, and of course Mrs. Edwards, quick with compliments for the young landowner and his means, but even more so with the lack of such for any other subject or creature. "It is all right, son. No doubt you were there only to eat. I imagine most of them were just there on account of their bellies. Heaven and earth, would I deliver our set such a thing, and but even half believe me? And how many present would you say? As to that, sir, 'twas a full row, one after another. Even the blue-coated gentleman that often walks about with his coat and hat misplaced, the gent that lives just up the way, was there, which the 2 young ladies from the Woodbridge gents took to soon after he'd arrived at the back of the room." Oh, Mr. Winter," cried Mrs. Edwards, converted from dismay concerning the adulteration of Mr. Moore's Bible to aggravated excitation. "Mr. Winter, that queer man! Of course he'd bob up if for no other reason than to sully the nave's floor with his muddy boots, but more the like to lead the cheering of Mr. Moore's heresy." All right there, Mrs. Edwards," said her husband, motioning for her to desist, for it was one thing to be gravely concerned about the lecture, which could easily be mistook as a sermon by common folk, considering from whom it was furnished, but it was entirely another thing to accuse a well-respected rector of heresy, even if it was so. Mrs. Edwards then took a bite of her mashed and buttered turnips, found the briefest delight in doing so, which was thusly extinguished by a painfully strained swallow that informed the tone of her next offering, though such was somewhat subdued by her husband's instruction. "Tell us, boy, and I'm afraid I already know the answer, so no need to be shy. Was either one of those ladies an overly handsome woman with the blackest of hair and the bluest of eyes? This question momentarily checked whatever happy disposition Mr. Wyatt had possessed up to that point, for the delight of the simple dishes about the table had been outweighing the disharmony of the Moor's tempers. But upon the mention of Miss Harriet Moore, his attention was rallied thoroughly to the conversation, and he turned his head toward the labourer, no doubt causing the man discomfort. Harrowing though it was, the man affirmed that it was Miss Moore who sat to the right of Mr. Winter, and from what he could tell in his limited experience of women, she had taken pleasure in the man's company, at least more so than did the other lady on his left. "Oh, Mr. Wyatt!" cried Mrs. Edwards, the man looking unmade as he stared blankly forward beyond his plate, chewing that which he had forgot to as he had listened to the thresher. "Mr. Wyatt, I am so sorry. Can you forgive me, sir? For I had the highest expectations of you and Miss Moore, a fine pairing of wealth, youth, and beauty. I did say, did I not, Mr. Edwards? But now, with this shameless perusing of that eccentric man inside the walls of her own church, right under the nose of her father, who's no doubt grown mad with grief at the loss of his brother, Faith, I believe I've made the gravest of errors. Mr. Weston, you were at the society meeting this last Wednesday. You did say, I believe. What kind of man did you make Mr. Winter out to be?" Mr. Wyatt asked, deferring his reply to the heartbroken Mrs. Edwards with but an empathetic look her direction. The man is a blafard, stumbling about his words in an ineloquent fashion about performing alchemy on the town's soils so as to improve them, he says, returned Mr. Weston. Why would I, you or any man give up authority over his own land and let another salt its fine fields for their pleasure? I did say to Mr. Smith, my neighbour and table companion, that evening, and that was the sentiment of the room too, until the gentleman offered to underlet any field he saw fit for his alchemy, certainly a ploy worked about between him and George Moore. You should have seen the others, lining up to ruin themselves afterward. Did he give any particulars as to his process? Asked Mr. Edwards, his curiosity whetted. But such was not a casual desire to move the conversation forward. The year of 1816 was still painfully on the mind of every farmer and gardener, as were the quarrymen that had ruined several of the next generation of farmers with their overpriced mineral manures. Mr. Edwards felt as though an ominous cloud was again on the horizon, with both Mr. Moore's scientific lecture and now Mr. Winter's alchemy upon the towns, having the capacity to swallow the land up and spit out its righteousness. It was but a pinprick at present, and none of it showed upon his face, but it was there none the less. Sir, he did. It had to do with growing wheat unnaturally in his glass house this winter, using soils from our lands fed with mineral manures. If that satisfied, he would repeat the operation on the fields by cart. And I needn't remind you about the quarrymen. I speculate by this month's end next year, several of our fields will be lime-sick. These revelations seemed only to add to Mrs. Edwards' suffering that Mr. Wyatt, also affected by them, but for his part with a new conviction, offered her, "It is all right, Mrs. Edwards. I do not mind a pinch of competition, nor a bushel from a man who apparently has little regard for the natural order of the world, given to us from above, and if marrying properly were the like to kiss my hand, we'd all have done it by now. As to her father's desire to ruin himself and his followers, and to her feral manner, I find it my duty as a right Christian to save her from such a kit. So do you not see? It was Providence that took hold your mind, dear woman, and drew the path from her to I. Let it be the blessing it is, and let you think no longer hard upon it. Oh, dear Mr. Wyatt, too kind indeed, returned Miss Edwards, whose spirit did lift noticeably, easily exonerated with but the least encouragement. It is as you say, I'm a vessel in which divinity may manifest himself. There you are, woman, tolerance, her husband said, matter-of-fact like, with the smile of a small triumph. And could it be I too have been called upon to restore some measure of sacred order to our parts? For I haven't the heart to see even the non-elect treated thus, either by ruined mind or ruined field, and it occurs to me these malignancies may be adjudicated by the examination of the subject of opinion. Who is to say, from the perspective of the natural philosopher, that Mr. Moore's or Mr. Winter's opinions are the preeminent positions in the respective fields with which they are preoccupied? Just as each sect of Christianity has its own contrivance of practice, it must follow that science too has a wealth and variety of opinion for any given discipline. I would hold that there are as many philosophical opinions as there are mouths that are fed by such work, and certainly there would be cases where one man would be at the end rope of another. Just as Mr. Wyatt must deliver this woman from tragedy, I too feel compelled to bring some fair balance of reason to Woodbridge and Hedgely, not just by my given lot, that is already baked into the bread, but by illuminating to the town the revelation that no one scientific opinion should be weighted more than any other that opposes it. It then will be clear that these men's pursuits are merely personal appetites. "Mr. Edwards, do you mean to become a natural philosopher?" asked Mr. Wyatt, the rest of the room churning in excitement at Mr. Edwards' eloquent thoughts, even the quiet labourer, half relieved that it was not he that was to be tried, inside or outside the rectory's private dining-room, nearly knocked over the decanter. "I do not. I have acquaintances in London who could recommend a philosophical man that we may fashion to the cause," the preacher returned. "Then I am happy to assist by any means prudent," the junior squire offered, and in doing so, feeling that much closer to, and longing that much more for his prize. "Capital, Mr. Wyatt, for I believe the man will need a commission." Chapter 3, Scene 5. "Good morn, Mr. Winter," called out Farmer James Arnold, waving his handkerchief that his position would be noticed as his new subtenant appeared from around the northern hedge of the property in question. The 12-acre field he stood upon was as plain as if it had suffered an exceptionally dry summer fallow, save lightly dispersed patches of furze in places and the plants depreciated, woody remnants in others, whilst a partially successful invasion of couchgrass, the bane of the right husbandman, occurred along its northern edge. This dereliction was something of an aberrancy, for just beyond that edge there was a flourishing linear grove of trees jaunting out of Hedgely Wood's southeastern extremity, and past such ran the River Compton, surrounded by one of his neighbour's hearty pastures. Mr. Winter waved back and started to proceed through the field to meet the farmer by means of a straight path, but it became apparent that the thorny furze had the better on him, so he rerouted his approach to the field's northern road, eventually employing the selfsame inlet Mr. Arnold had used to achieve his present position. It was a fine day, with very little fresh mud to be had upon their boots. "I did purchase these properties only 10 years ago," said the farmer after the topics of the weather and season had been exhausted, "and found this field fallowed, probably for many a year afore that. I cleaned about 6 acres or so with the intention of clover and rye grass as a cover, but to my astonishment they had rather a hard pull coming up, and existed rather sickly and patched, as if Odysseus himself had come along with his horse and salt. I asked round to my neighbours, knowing little of the area other than that land here was cheap, and the one fella whose fields lay south o' here, Mr. Merriman, still down there bless him, said that he seen the man afore me burn the whole field through and through, which he reckoned was on account of the furze or couch that you see has once again gotten hold of the place, perhaps just as mad as Odysseus. But even afore that, never was there a luxuriant crop cultivated here, which may too explain the attempt at burning. Indeed, furze does produce a credible alkali ash that would generally make a good manure," said Mr. Winter, "but it is unfortunate that this soil is so light and silicious that torrefaction may be nothing but injurious. I found in it very little impalpable matter, scant offerings of the calcareous sort that the soils of your other fields do contain, and what a luminous component there was, partly took the form of a gritty mass, no doubt fused by the heat, so that it now acts as if it were the coarse sand which is in overabundance. Further, there is but 1 part in 400 of carbonate of magnesia, again unlike our surrounds, and no gypsum, this being the plum of your problem regarding the clover and artificial grass, and a few parts charcoal that confirms Mr. Merriman's account. The farmer looked about the land forlornly. His son had recently married, and what little money came with the woman would be used to work the western fields of his property, which, save the one he was standing upon, were presently let to Mr. Merriman and the other adjacent farms. Were it to be reinvigorated, the field would add a significant element to his son's rotations, but were it not so, such made it all the more hard to embark on the venture. He motioned at his possible preserver to gaze northward, noting, "And not even the couch is as enterprising as is characteristic." They then ran their eyes up and down the boundary at the various punctures the grass had attempted. Bulbous, knotted, jointed, goosegrass, pickpurse, docks, and was like a piece of woven cloth, said Winter, continuing to look ahead at the semi-failed invasion. "Sir? Oh, perhaps I misspoke. I beg pardon. I was recalling a passage in the author Richard Parkinson's book, The English Practice of Agriculture, that I saw a bit of humour in. He, too, found a great adversary in the couch." Mr. Arnold's eyes drifted off of Mr. Winter's face as he confessed he had not read it, that most of what he knew came from his father, who, though adequate with numbers, did little reading, and that his current practices were mostly to do with following those of his neighbours and fellow society members. "Well, never mind that," Mr. Winter replied. "Let us find some means of restoration. The land is flat here, and though the river runs so close, it would be of great expense to train the water to the field and make adequate means of drainage that it once again continue on its present path for the benefit of the community. No doubt the small mill at the western edge of the field would gravely object too. However, I would expect there is water not too far down under the ground, which with the sandy texture of the soil has conspired to take away any improvement that the burning did produce with regard to the ashen manure. Thus, we must restore the impalpable qualities of the soil to retain what moisture falls and what nutrients we may add through our own manuring. Firstly, we must restore the fine calcareous material that your other fields enjoy, for we will endeavour to mimic the proportions of the earthly components of your adequately producing fields. There is great good in the imitation of nature. By the by, when was the last time you limed any of your land, Mr. Arnold? "Sir, I've never done so. I've never had the need," the farmer said. Then, after a moment's hesitation, he added, "There was a young man I used to let the western part of my property to, who did attempt some like improvement in the poverty year by way of the set of wicked quarrymen, which I'm sure your Mr. Parkinson would have a few descriptions for." "Yes," said Mr. Winter, recalling his first evening at the Agricultural Society, the laissez-faire men who could not defeat the climate. "Those exact. Well, considering them, and considering the number of instances here and about where no real benefit has come of it. It is understandable, sir, for the practice is too often misapplied and used for improper purposes, but allow me to submit the following. What the field wants in calcareous matter, it does not in inert vegetative matter on account of the furze and its roots. Thus were we to plough it into the ground, whilst applying a good yellow clay marl or pulverised limestone to answer this primary want, and then lime, it would bring about a more hasty putrefaction of these inert components, giving the soil some nutrition for a right field of grass next year. Further, upon either this ploughing or the springs, a bit of gypsum should be added to answer the deficiency, for clover, sainfoin, and your other artificials depend on it. I will be collecting the stuff a few miles north of here on behalf of another man whose field is in excess of carbonate of lime, if you can believe it. If you haven't the heart for lime, we could alternatively par the field, collect everything above ground and burn it in a pile that the fire does no more injury to the land, and then lay the ash in with the marl or limestone, though I suspect we would have a greater requirement for animal manure or peat by this route. Incidentally, peat and a bit of caustic lime derived from magnesian limestone should produce a quick manure for next spring and solve your want of magnesia in this soil, though if the ratio is not fixed properly, the caustic magnesia can be injurious to plants. I will, of course, be testing our final decision with my winter operations, though for this particular field I shall substitute the winter wheat for, say, sainfoin, cocksfoot and meadow fescue, for they are indifferent to the sandy soil or a dry summer spell. And thirdly, if we are in no fear of work, we could par the excess wheat stubble of your field yonder just before this one. I can assure you it affords no meaningful nutrients to its present land, as is commonly believed around these parts. We would then largely fold whatever sheep can be brought around the greatest patches of living furze, putting the stubble bedding about the plants, that they may be encouraged to go at them, and adding more hay as needed. I suspect they will be slow to eat the furze, the cause being the thorns, so if we find the pace dire, we could commission the mill there to break the plants, that they be more palatable. If they will take it quick enough, we would then manage other patches of the field similarly, or par them and deliver them to the fold. At intervals, we would too cover the manure in dirt and move the bedding to another part of the plot. Such an operation would partially relieve our want of gypsum and impalpable matter, but at the cost of getting at the inert matter by way of plough and lime, and certainly at the cost of time and labour. Mr. Arnold thought on his options for a moment, but could not come to an immediate decision. Mr. Winter seemed to possess a prolific knowledge of manuring for having never cultivated a piece of land himself, yet it was also equally plain that he was no quarryman or irreputable capitalist. "Sir, you seem to know a great deal about the manuring of lands," he stated, adding, "and want of fine calcareous or magnesian earth, you say? The soil fails to effervesce in my acidic liquor, and with no mentionable milky response in aqua fortis. And grass would answer, rather than turnip," Mr. Winter assured him, just as he'd done many a Woodbridge farmer over the last several days. He now had 10 fields belonging to 8 out of the 24 farmers that inhabited the townships, upon which to practice Sir Humphrey Davy's recommendations in the mineral improvement of soil. There too was a small faction that was indifferent to his proposals, either shy from the quarrymen or for the part of the southern Hedgely farmers like Mr. Weston, stubborn, and as Mr. Moore had noted, quick to afford passages from the Holy Book for some justification to their position. Mr. Arnold, however, did seem satisfied when Mr. Winter concluded their discourse by remarking that though he was presently making private recommendations for each field to its respective custodian, he would be, upon the permission of those constituents, introducing his prescriptions publicly at the next society meeting. This, for Mr. Arnold's part, was considered wise, that he may collect any thoughtful objections, ideally secondary to the vast experience the group altogether did contain. And further, he did not want to look a flat by attempting that which has already been done so with unkind result. Yet there was some justified hesitation by Mr. Winter regarding these presentations. Now that he had properly toured the area, examined the details of the below-average yield histories of some of its farms, and learned that a fair set of practitioners were implementing lay farming on lands that would otherwise answer credibly to more advanced rotation, he wondered if there ever had been a philosophical farmer among them, or even a man stocked with a drop of muriatic acid, a mortar and pestle or the like, in this sheltered crevice of the Cotswolds.